Hello all and welcome back to Shatter Our Souls with Novaria. Today, we are tackling the Zora River and Zora's Domain area. Now if you know the rules, you know the rules. But I basically cannot use any weapons or tools from the first three tabs in the menu, that being the sword, shield, and bow tab. With that out of the way, let's get into the So Coffee Shrine, because why not? Now, today I wanted to take a bit of a look at the history of the various Zoras that crop up around The Legend of Zelda as a whole. And the first thing I need to mention is that there are three distinct groups. The first is the River Zoras. Think the Zoras from A Link to the Past, A Link to the World, the Fallen Hero timeline. The ones that shoot fireballs at you all the time. The second are the River Zora. Think of Rudo or Ocarina of Time era of Zora. The third are what I personally call Ocean Zora. And these ones are more like Sidon, Mipha, and King Dorifon. Now, the reason I bring this up is because each group of Zora actually has a somewhat distinct role to play within their respective worlds. Where Ocarina of Time had a much more laissez-faire, they're in charge of the waterways of Hyrule, others had placed a lot more emphasis on the Zoras being guardians and protectors of Hyrule, Termina, and the like. Anywho, the earliest iteration of Zora that we come across actually is from Skyward Sword. And for those of you who might be familiar with it, you'll know that I'm talking about the jellyfish-like creatures that show up around the Great Water Dragon, Barret. And the idea behind them was that they were guardians of the waterways, but they were also guardians and protectors of the Great Water Dragon herself. And this is all well and good. We don't necessarily get much of a look into the Zoras at this point in time, but rather we get a rather pointed look in their direction saying, hey, by the way, these guys are not villains per se, but they exist as individuals who are fiercely loyal to their cause. Anyway, with that in mind, the next Zoras we come across are the Zoras in Ocarina of Time. Now there are notably only a couple that actually come up as being important in that they're actually named. One of them is, of course, Rudo. The second is the Zora King. Now, I'll admit I don't actually remember his name right this instant, but effectively, Rudo was the Sage of Water. During the era of Ocarina of Time, or era of the Hero of Time, the Zora were, at this time, considered the River Zora. These are the ones that are... No, sorry. These ones are the Lake Zoras. They're much more fish-like in appearance, but not like a catfish like the River Zoras. The reason I personally make this distinction is because in the end, the Zoras of Zora's Domain in Ocarina of Time don't really have any bad blood between them and the Hylian. They just kind of exist. They are guardians of the waterways, they are guardians of Hyrule in and of itself in many ways, shapes, and forms. But we want to get to the real meat of it. And I promise, it is coming. The Zora that show up in Wind Waker are specifically, well, Lake or Ocean Zora. But what I find interesting about these particular ones is that they haven't evolved to a point of having like shark or whale-like features. Instead, being very similar to the Lake Zoras, I almost got into my head there, they're very similar to the Lake Zora. Characters like Mikau, I believe her name is Lulu, although I admit I'm not 100% certain at this moment, in Termina, are both guardians of their area, but are also musicians. This suggests that there's a lot more of the cultural aspect of the Zoras themselves. They're about art, they are about crafting, but there's much more that to what makes a Zora than just their distinct physical features. One thing I will mention about it is that the Lake Zoras generally have a more serene grace approach to everything, comparatively to their counterpart, the River Zora. Now, the most common of the third variety comes from Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom.
Say hey there, young one. Up top, above you. Pardon the entrance, but you're a hylian, aren't you? I was hoping perhaps you'd have a moment to talk.
And Sidon is probably the most notable of the newly formed Ocean Zora group. These ones are much larger in appearance than their counterpart, the Lake Zora, and are astonishingly long-lived. Sidon here looks like he's in his prime, but he is over 100 years old. In fact, King Dorifan, who is Sidon's father, is probably in the 200 to 300-year-old range, and he is still very healthy, very strong. The reason why I want to bring this up is because the Ocean Zoras are more long-lived and have more diverse features. Sidon having that hammerhead look to his sculpted shell, shall we say, whereas their attendant, Muzu, has much more of a stingray appearance. I personally love this design change in the Zoras because I truly believe that they could have been more than what they appeared in older games. But enough on that. When we get to other games earlier in the timeline, you have the Sage of, I believe it was the Sage of Wind, who is, no, Sage of Earth, who replaces, who is replaced by Medley in Wind Waker. And this particular Zora is, of course, one that had passed on long ago. What I think makes the most sense with this particular look at it is that it was an Ocean Zora. But unfortunately, due to circumstances beyond the control of the main cast in Wind Waker and the adult timeline, the Zora tended to disappear. The Childling timeline had, of course, Termina and the Zoras of Great Bay. But you also ended up with them being guardians of the waterworks, as well as guardians of Termina's water sources. The third, or next end line, comes in the form of the Zoras of Twilight Princess. Once again, we're looking at more Lake Zora-esque. But this group has two distinct, I suppose, appearances. The first is the Queen herself. Now, the Queen of the Zora has less of a humanoid appearance and more of a fish-like appearance, being probably the first true mermaid-esque looking character since Ocarina of Time. The reason I want to bring this up is because the Queen herself is showing a level of further evolution of the Zora clan in Twilight Princess, simply due to the fact that she is more mermaid and her fins have gone to her legs rather than the back of her head. Why they're on the back of the head, I still have no answer for. But be that as it may. We then end up going further on in the timeline to the late Four Swords adventures. This one's a little bit of a contentious point, but I've always found that Four Swords adventures had probably the weirdest relationship with most of the groups in the world, such as Kakariko Village being a village of thieves, once again, as well as other villages and other groups like the Gerudo despising Ganondorf being a very common trope. But then if you take another look at some of the other characters like the Zora, the ocean and Lake Zora have all disappeared, leaving in their wake the only remaining Zora group being the River Zoras. They're catfish-like in appearance. They have long whiskers, a frilled neck, and many games that have them treat them as both hero and villain. And I think what they're trying to get at is that these characters are not necessarily evil. They're not bestial in nature. They're not monsters. Rather, they're protectors and guardians. But due to the nature of how Hyrule goes through difficult times on a rather regular basis, they end up being more irritable when it comes to dealing with outsiders. Thus, they start attacking people nearby just for the sake of they're tired of having to deal with the same problems over and over again. And I kind of have to give them credit for that. Unfortunately, most of the Fallen Hero timeline does focus very heavily on this realm of the Zora. But Zelda's Echoes of Wisdom is ironically the only time that I can think of that all Zora kind of intermingle, if you will. You have the Ocean or Lake Zora and the River Zora coexisting to worship King or Lord Jabu Jabu, which to me suggests that they're not as different as they might try or seem to be. Ooh, food. And so, in the end, I suppose it really comes down to your personal opinion of the various varieties. But who knows? Maybe I'm just speaking from lack of understanding or experience. Tell me in the comments below if you agree or disagree with anything I'm saying. Anyways, we are now getting to the point where we're about halfway to Zora's domain. And truth be told, I very much love this depiction of the Zoras. I don't think I've mentioned in any capacity that each iteration of characters generally has a little bit of a theme to it. And the ones that tend to stick out to me are the ones that break the mold, change up what you're expecting of the characters. And when you look at Ocarina of Time, Twilight Princess, or even the Fallen Hero timeline, every Zora you come across comes with this ideology of grace, of serenity. And the ones that break the mold are ones like Ruto, who is strong-willed and hard-headed. Or, dare I say, Mipha and Sidon. What makes these two so unique compared to the rest of the Zoras that you see is that the Mipha and Sidon have kind of opposing ideologies. Mipha is the more reserved healer. She protects those around her, but isn't really one to get involved in fights herself, typically speaking. She is the Zora champion. She is incredibly skilled. She knows her way around a spear. I don't want to give the implication that she is not a powerful Zora warrior, but rather her preferred method of dealing with conflicts is not a head-on approach. It is about approaching the problem in a way that seeks to reduce the damage done at any point in time. Thus, she focuses on being a healer in and of itself. I like this depiction of her for that reason, because in the end, she is simply doing what she feels is right. Sidon, on the other hand, if you look at his depiction, his goals, he is viewed very much as a angsty teenager. He jumps at every occasion to try to prove himself to be worthy, to being the next sage, to being the next champion. And every time he comes up, he ends up being incredibly useful, incredibly helpful to the cause of saving and helping Hyrule. But he's also one of those characters that I believe has a chip on his shoulder. He doesn't want to be reserved. He doesn't want to hide away. You can see this depiction of him in every version that you see him. There's the childlike version from Age of Calamity, where in the introduction of the game, introduction of the character in Age of Calamity, he grabs a spear as a child and runs up Polymus Mountain to fight a Lionel head-on. He's not the type of character who wants to hide away. He's the type of character who wants to solve the issues, admittedly in the most bullheaded way he can. But he's not about serenity. He's not about great. He's about trying to do what he feels is necessary to complete said task. And I'll give him credit where it's due. He is easily my favorite Zora in the entirety of Legend of Zelda's extended world and lore. But there is something about him that, for many, is kind of a little bit of a stretch. But he is very much a depiction of the Greek god Poseidon. And first of all, I don't believe that was anything remotely accidental about that choice of naming him Sidon. But the thing about Sidon being I suppose, an similar-ish character to Poseidon, the god of the sea, does speak volumes to his character. He's a little bit brash. He doesn't like taking loss. He doesn't like when he is deemed to be in the wrong. He tends, more often than not, to try to prove himself, to act out of pride more than anything. And that, I think, is one of the more notable aspects of this character, of who he is, simply due to the fact that he can be whatever he needs to be. And maybe I'm overinflating my statement on this character, but I've always found him to be the most interesting of the Zoras to date. Anywho, we are now officially reaching Zora's Domain. And I suppose a little bit of a introduction is necessary. Link and Mipha were friends way back in the day. Mipha was in love with Link, believing him to be one of her closest friends and one of the people that she would trust with her life. Somebody that she was willing to go the mile to protect at all costs. And after she fell in the Great Calamity, Link really didn't have very many people left to lean on. Urbosa, Revali, Daruk, and Mipha all fell within a relatively short span of time. This, of course, means that Link and Zelda were left alone. And while both Link and Zelda survive, it doesn't necessarily bode well for their overall circumstances. The Zoras in Breath of the Wild have a few major problems that need to be solved. The first and foremost is that the Zoras themselves are unable to solve a very specific problem, requiring the help of another group, either a Gerudo or a Hylian. Now, theoretically, you could also go with a Rito, but the Rito, I'm assuming, can't fly very well in wet weather. But theoretically, each of these potential options would be potentially beneficial. And, well, I suppose it comes down to this. The Zora's domain in Breath of the Wild is on the verge of destruction. It is slowly but surely being drowned. Slowly but surely, it is being flooded. And while it's not a problem for Zora's per se, it is a problem for the rest of Hyrule. Divine Beast Vah-Ruta, named after their late Princess Ruto, is capable of producing almost limitless amounts of water. And this is a good thing, in theory. It is capable of saving all of Hyrule from massive droughts. It is capable of saving Hyrule and the surrounding areas from major climate disasters simply due to the fact that it can be used to produce water in nearly endless quantities. But the trick to it is that these nearly endless quantities have a couple of limitations. The first major limitation that we're going to come across is that if you have too much, there's such thing as too much of a good thing. And that is the primary concern of the Zora in Breath of the Wild. There is too much. And the Zoras themselves, while they have the capability, are kind of stuck in a situation where they need to shut down Vah-Ruta, believing that only by shutting it down are we truly going to be able to live freely. That only after Vah-Ruta is shut down will they be able to rest easy, knowing that Hyrule is safe. And I have to give them credit for actually putting that much care into it, because all of Hyrule is dependent on this primary reservoir for providing clean, healthy water to the rest of the kingdom. But trying to make it functional is the hard part. And Breath of the Wild does try to at least limit the concerns of the characters. It slowly but surely, the reservoirs have been filling up. And while this isn't a negative in most circumstances, as I said, too much of a good thing. The reservoir is about to burst. If the dam cannot be stopped, if the reservoir does burst, then all of Hyrule will end up in a situation where a large portion of the kingdom will be underwater. That's it. That's all. The easiest way to shut down Vah-Ruta is with electrical arrows, something that, unfortunately, Sidon, who is the go-getter of the Zora, can't use. In fact, a little electrical shock is the only thing that can truly shut down the pumps that Varuta is endlessly supplying water with, and yet simultaneously, despite it being the best and potentially only solution for this problem, I really need to stop blowing myself up. Despite it being possibly the only solution available to the Zora, their methods of executing it are going to be few and far between. And that's where Link comes in. Link is supposed to fire arrows at the yellow spots on Varuta's four corners and the endless water spout, which, by the rules of the run, is not possible. As I'm not allowed to use a bow, I have to use an alternative method of gaining access to Varuta, or not at all. And the problem is that there isn't really a solution. So the two solutions that come to mind are, of course, the electric arrows, which are not functional, and electric chew jelly. Now, I've been using chew jelly a couple times throughout this run as a substitute for other abilities. Think of using it as a means of starting a fire without a fire arrow, or without flint and a silver sword and a steel sword. These options are there to provide me with a semblance of capability to get through what needs to be gotten through. The problem is, I'm at an impasse. I can't drop electric chew jelly while flying, which means I have two options left, which means there's only one other option of electrical interference that I can come up with at this moment, and that is electrical weaponry. Think the thunder blades that you get in various boss battles and whatnot. And these thunder blades, while they are incredibly useful in the moment, are simply not feasible in this run either. So, despite everything, Varuta is most likely a non-completable mission. Anywho, King Dorephan is the ruler of the Zora, taking the shape of what looks to be some form of deep-sea whale. And honestly, I'll give him credit where it's due. He is a very strong-looking individual. But Dorephan is also at an age where he is seeking to bequeath the throne unto his son Sidon, something that he would have ordinarily offered to Mipha. But I digress. Here we are. Anywho, at this point in time, there aren't very many avenues to complete the Lanayru section of Zelda Breath of the Wild. It's all water-based. It's all, well, put simply, the necessity for weapons of any variety kind of make this a difficult challenge to get through. Unfortunately, it will mean that I most likely only have one, maybe two more shrines in this area that are possible without the use of weapons. And that's kind of the disappointing part of this section here. Each of the divine beasts rely on some form of weaponry to get into. While some are more doable than others, the two that I can almost guarantee I won't be able to complete are the Varuta, which ironically which is the almost guaranteed not to work, and Valmeadow. But I haven't given up hope. I am going to try to access each of them in some capacity. Ruta is just the one that I truly believe to be the hardest and least likely to work of the four. But be that as it may, every little bit counts, every single solution matters. So, let's get it. So, I suppose I need to talk a little bit about why I believe each of them is impossible or unlikely. The first reason is because Breath of the Wild's four divine beasts each have a section leading up to them. In the case of Ruta, that's the lightning electrical arrow problem. Udania is actually the easiest to access by the current rule set allows, because the bulk of the problem comes from the fact that I effectively have to play it as a stealth mission and use Yonobo's capabilities to allow for the defeat of the Divine Beast in and of itself prior to the main battle. Teba will allow Link to battle the Divine Beast provided that Link beats a target practice minigame, which, while it is not a likely circumstance, in fact I don't think I can do it simply because I can't use the bow, means that I might never actually get the chance to battle against Meadow at all. The third requires, or the last of them, requires the use of various capabilities to even attempt to access it. This is in the form of showcasing what Link can do by getting ice for the Gerudo, beating the Yiga clan, collecting the Thunder Helm, and after all of that is said and done, turn around and use some form of explosions on the feet of the great divine beast Va Naboris to be able to defeat that side of the equation. All of these together make it a very difficult task to enter any of the divine beasts. Meaning, in theory, all of them are not feasible for this run. Again, I'm attempting, but we'll see what ends up happening. Anywho, Muzu has the key to access most of this area. He is not exactly Hylian friendly, believing that Hylians were the ones that led to the Great Calamity with their hubris, digging up all of the various divine beasts and the guardians from across the landscape. But honestly, I can't say I blame him. When the Calamity struck, it also took his favorite student, Mifa. And he's hurt. And I wouldn't fault him for being hurt, for feeling lost, afraid, or dare I say, angry, for lashing out at those around him who are perceived as different, because in his mind they're all guilty of the same problem. Anywho. Link and Sidon, of course, try to appeal to Muzu's better judgment, believing that in the end, it was a necessary loss. I can't necessarily say it is necessary, but it is one that can't be taken back, but is one that can be grown from. And I think that's kind of the beauty of these characters. Every single one of them has something more they could be, something more they would like, something that would lead them towards greener pastures and greater ambitions. But ultimately, a lot of the characters are lost in their anger or lost in the past.
I was thinking, this reminds me of the time we first met. You were just a reckless child, always getting yourself hurt at every turn. Every time, I would heal you, just as I'm doing right now. I thought it was funny how, being a hylian, you looked grown up so much faster than I did. I was always willing to heal your wounds, even back then. So if this Calamity Ganon does in fact return, what can we really do? We just don't seem to know much about what we'll be up against. But know this, that no matter how difficult this battle might get, if anyone ever tries to do you harm, then I will heal you. No matter when or how bad the wound, I hope you know that I will always protect you. Once this whole thing is over, maybe things can go back to how they used to be when we were young. You know, perhaps we could spend some time together.
Her eyes were always on Link, and Link's eyes were often on Zelda. And it's a shame, really, that the pair of them didn't always see eye to eye. But, dare I say, the individuals themselves exist as part of a grander solution, part of a grander world. Anyways, with the Zora armor, handcrafted by Mipha in hand, Muzu, of course, will pass on the information of how to get shock arrows. This being the Lionel of Polymus Mountain. But that's about as close as we're gonna get to them. Well, I can use the shock arrows and get there. Beating a Lionel with nothing but bombs and a metallic rock isn't exactly the most reasonable or feasible solution that I have come up with. So, for now, I am going to have to say that that's not going to be in the cards. But what do I know? Maybe at some point I'll be able to tackle every single one of the bosses and mini-bosses with just bombs, with just the tools at my disposal. But that's maybe a little while yet. Speaking of just a little while yet, I have a couple solutions to earlier problems, which might actually do the trick. So, we know in Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom that if you end up with a certain number with pine cones, you can set fires. Big ones. Theoretically, you can also get into shrines just higher up. But maybe I'll test that later. For now, like the video, drop a comment down below, and we'll catch you next time. Until then, have a good one.